Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Starship and the Canoe by Kenneth Brower. Forward by Neil Stevenson. Narrated by David Vries. Forward. In the 10th chapter of Kenneth Brower's The Starship and the Canoe, George Dyson, who at that point has been introduced as a curious, solitary, tree-dwelling delinquent and wanderer, speaks. Brower quotes 3 paragraphs from an account written by George describing a sea voyage he undertook circa 1970 in a newly christened vessel he had helped build. Brower introduces the passage gingerly, making mention of George's Victorian prose style. Decades ago, when I first read this, before I had met George, my immediate reaction was to wish that I could see a great deal more in the same vein on almost any topic from the younger Dyson. Despite, or perhaps because of, his difficult and quite brief relationship with the apparatus of formal education, George had obviously taught himself how to write. And in the same way as he made choices around tools, materials, clothing, and lifestyle, namely picking what worked best for the purpose regardless of what anyone else might think, he had settled on a prose style that did its job as well as a chisel cuts wood, and as such needed no improvement. Later at the head of Chapter 18, Brower quotes George again, describing himself as one who adopts a slender form little influenced by wind and waves. It is ostensibly about how to paddle a kayak in rough conditions, but clearly has a more general significance. At that point, the book dates to the late 1970s. George seems as elusive to curious readers of Brower's fascinating and sui generis book as that passage implies. Less than a decade later, though, George began to tell his own story in Biography, the kayak, and 10 years after that he published Darwin Among the Machines, the first in a series of books usually billed as History of Science, though this doesn't quite capture what they are. Biography is nominally an exploration of Russo-Aleut boat building translated into modern materials, so you must read between the lines and look closely at the beautiful photography of Anne Yao, who later married George, for clues about the enigmatic figure, the innovative boats, and the famous treehouse described by Brower. In like manner, George's History of Science books, though they are as meticulously researched as any academic publications, are nominally about figures such as Leibniz, Darwin, von Neumann, Ted Taylor, and Freeman. But they are also about George, in the sense that only George could or would have written them. Only he has access to, and the implicit trust of, some of the people he is writing about. And a man capable of living alone in a treehouse has the leeway to write what he thinks without concern for, or even awareness of, the fads and perverse incentives that dominate the lives of academics. Freeman, too, has found more of a public voice in the decades since the first publication of The Starship and the Canoe. It was for a long time vaguely known that the British war machine had put his brain to work on something related to bombers during the Second World War. Brower alludes to this, relating a story that Freeman once, without any explanation, sent George a copy of Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut's masterpiece about the firebombing of Dresden. The true nature of that wartime research was finally explained by Freeman himself in a Technology Review article published in 2006. This was, as you would expect, quite interesting on a technical level, but it also bore the hallmark of Freeman's best non-academic writing in what it said about the culture and psychology of bomber crews and the brass who sent them into harm's way. It has much to teach us about the difficulties that the human mind has with thinking statistically, even when one's life depends upon it. More recently, Freeman has published Maker of Patterns, an autobiography through letters, in which, among many other things, he retells the story from the end of Starship, in which George, assisted by Brower, saves the lives of 2 boaters by dint of keen perception, awareness of nautical hazards, and decisive action. Along the way, the book spans the years from 1941 to 1978, we are treated to a wide range of anecdotes and reflections, many of which are quite personal, given that the book consists of letters Freeman wrote to his family. There is much here that is remarkable, one example being Freeman's Zelig-like knack of turning up at important moments in history. To name just one example, he stumbles into the Civil Rights March of 1963 by pure luck and personally witnesses Martin Luther King Jr. delivering the "I Have a Dream" speech. In the 40 years since Ken Brower drew our attention to Freeman and George Dyson in the Starship and the Canoe, both father and son have therefore become accessible to readers in a way that was not possible when George was living alone in a treehouse and Freeman was mostly writing papers for scientific journals. It is rewarding to reread Brower's book in light of all that has happened since. His depiction of a time and place, mostly the Pacific coast of Canada and Alaska in the 1970s, is beautifully crafted, terse prose that often flourishes into poetry. The curious dynamic between the father and the son, which left the reader in suspense 40 years ago, is all the more satisfying now that we know it all came out well in the end. In the summer 2017 issue of California, the Berkeley alumni magazine, Ken Brower looked back on the intervening decades. The result is a long and wide-ranging article that reads as a worthy sequel. The themes and story revealed in the book are still both interesting in their own right and relevant to larger concerns very much in the forefront of the mind of anyone who pays attention to what is happening now around global climate change and other environmental concerns. Today's political and environmental climate provides, Brower writes, an ideal temperature for asking again a question posed by my book. To what should we be adapting? To this blue-green sphere down here with its single sun, good for only 5 billion more years, or to the glittery firmament above? The conservation message in Starship is not strident, but it's potent, and even more important today than when this book came out in the era of Earth Day and the Whole Earth Catalog. Not enough has changed. Neal Stephenson, February 2020. Neal Stephenson is known for his speculative fiction exploring areas such as mathematics, cryptography, philosophy, currency, and the history of science. He is the author or co-author of more than 15 books, including Anathem, Snow Crash, and most recently, Fall or Dodge in Hell. Part 1. 1. Boom, boom, boom. As long as Freeman Dyson can remember, his thoughts have been on the stars. Those thoughts have not been commonplace. Dyson is one of the foremost theoretical physicists this planet has produced. At the very top of the ivory tower, among the membership of that preternaturally brilliant, uncombed fraternity who doodle equations on napkins, who forget to wear their galoshes, and who tend in mid-sentence to depart conversation and the world for new calculations on how the universe is put together, Dyson is regarded as a man with a special gift. More than one of his colleagues have described his place as stellar. He is a principal architect of the theory of quantum electrodynamics. He has made contributions to the theories of statistical mechanics and matter in the solid state. He has worked in pure mathematics and in particle physics. He helped design a very successful nuclear reactor. But Dyson's preoccupation has been space. He has not been content, like Einstein, to probe space with his phenomenal intuition, nor, though he writes well, to travel there like Asimov by his pen and imagination. He wants to go in person. He has helped design a craft to take him. In 1958, Dyson took a leave of absence from the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton and moved to La Jolla, California, where he joined a group of 40 scientists and engineers working on a project called Orion. His colleagues in La Jolla were all brilliant and were all dead serious. They intended to explore space themselves bodily. They had no hope for conventional rocketry as a means for reaching much of anything beyond the moon. The enormous energy required for a voyage to the planets and beyond could only be nuclear. They worked out a system they called nuclear pulse propulsion. From a hole in the bottom of the Orion spaceship, nuclear bombs would be dropped at intervals and detonated. The shock of each shaped charge and debris from it would strike a pusher plate at the ship's bottom, sending the ship forward. Orion would bomb itself through space at enormous speeds. It would be equipped with shock absorbers to protect crew and machinery from the nuclear jolts, and with shielding against the heat and radiation. It was crazy, of course, except apparently it wasn't. Orion was supported by Nobel laureates Harold Urey, Niels Bohr, and Hans Bethe. General Curtis LeMay liked the idea, and Wernher von Braun followed its progress respectfully. Even NASA contributed some money. Dyson and the others worked out detailed plans for a ship that would quickly carry 8 men and 100 tons of equipment to Mars and back. This solar system model became the heart of the project, and most of Dyson's energy went into it. He was personally curious about Mars and about Saturn as well, for these were places he hoped to visit in the flesh. But Dyson is a man much concerned with human destiny, and his attention soon ranged beyond his own solar system and his own lifespan. Immortality for the human race requires colonization of the stars, he believes, or at very least of the comets. He sketched out plans for a gargantuan ark, a starship the size of a city and powered by hydrogen bombs. Riding a monstrous concatenation of explosions, thundering silently through the void, leaving behind it a trail brighter than 1,000 suns, this vessel would centuries hence take his descendants, frozen if necessary, to Alpha Centauri or another star. George Dyson, Freeman's only son, has another idea. George wants to build a canoe, a great ocean-going kayak. 2. Almost a Mad Stare. Freeman Dyson is a slender man of middle height. His hair is dark, still, and he moves youthfully. His head is long, but not oversized in any futuristic way. His nose is large. He dresses without eccentricity or absent-mindedness, but he dresses a bit drably. He is not a man much concerned with appearances. He does have one mannerism of the sort that the world associates with its physicists, that tendency to retire from companionship, from the human plane, and from sentences in progress while he pursues some thought. He was born in England and spent his youth there, and he speaks still with a trace of his native accent. Dyson's eyes are his striking feature. They are dominated by the irises. The pupils seem too small, as if he were gazing always into a very bright light. His eyes are large, gray, and steady, and he holds them wide open. Almost a mad stare, I have to say it, one of his Orion colleagues has said. Freeman's son George is slender too. He stands about 4 inches taller than his father and is a shade darker. In the summertime on the waterways of British Columbia, where George has lived from the time he was 17, the long days and the refracted sunlight tan him so darkly that he is taken for an Indian. He dresses entirely in wool, which stays warm when wet, and he is impatient with northerners who don't dress that way. His taste, or his necessity, runs to long woolen underwear, baggy, oft-patched wool trousers, ragged wool sweaters, and wool watch caps. He often goes barefoot. His hair is moderately long, and it hangs scraggly in the rain. He is in his early 20s, and his beard is still sparse. It's a Northwest Indian beard, Nootka or Quakiutl. They have either no beards at all, wrote Captain Cook, which was most commonly the case, or a small thin one upon the point of the chin, which does not arise from any defect on that part, but from plucking it out more or less. George achieves the effect naturally. He looks less like the son of a British physicist than the bastard of a French Indian trapper. But under the beard, the long hair, and the tan, George bears strong resemblance to his father. He has the same long face. His cranium, on the outside at least, is identical. He has the big nose. Both Freeman Dyson and George Dyson have broken their noses, but George's break is more spectacular. His nose takes several turns before finishing. He is homely handsome. His features are strong, but they lack the nice symmetry and proportion that break young girls' hearts. His eyes are his extraordinary feature. They are so dominated by the irises that the pupils seem pinpricks. His eyes are large, green, and steady, and he holds them wide open. 3. Comets. First, I have to clear away a few popular misconceptions about space as a habitat, said Freeman Dyson, lecturing in London in 1972. It is generally considered that planets are important. Except for Earth, they are not. Mars is waterless, and the others are, for various reasons, basically inhospitable to man. It is generally considered that beyond the Sun's family of planets there is absolute emptiness extending for light years until you come to another star. In fact, it is likely that the space around the solar system is populated by huge numbers of comets, small worlds a few miles in diameter, rich in water and the other chemicals essential to life. We see one of these comets only when it happens to suffer a random perturbation of its orbit, which sends it plunging close to the Sun. It seems that roughly one comet per year is captured into the region near the Sun, where it eventually evaporates and disintegrates. If we assume that the supply of distant comets is sufficient to sustain this process over the thousands of millions of years that the solar system has existed, then the total population of comets loosely attached to the Sun must be numbered in the thousands of millions. The combined surface area of these comets is then 1,000 or 10,000 times that of Earth. I conclude from these facts that comets, not planets, are the major potential habitat of life in space. If it were true that other stars have as many comets as the Sun, it then would follow that comets pervade our entire galaxy. We have no evidence either supporting or contradicting this hypothesis. If true, it implies that our galaxy is a much friendlier place for interstellar travelers than it is popularly supposed to be. The average distance between habitable oases in the desert of space is not measured in light years, but it is of the order of a light day or less. I propose to you, then, an optimistic view of the galaxy as an abode of life. Countless millions of comets are out there, amply supplied with water, carbon, and nitrogen, the basic constituents of living cells. We see when they fall close to the Sun that they contain all the common elements necessary to our existence. They lack only two essential requirements for human settlement, namely warmth and air. And now biological engineering will come to our rescue. We shall learn to grow trees on comets. To make a tree grow in airless space by the light of a distant sun is basically a problem of redesigning the skin of its leaves. In every organism, the skin is the crucial part which must be most delicately tailored to the demands of the environment. The skin of a leaf in space must satisfy four requirements. It must be opaque to far ultraviolet radiation to protect the vital tissues from radiation damage. It must be impervious to water. It must transmit visible light to the organs of photosynthesis. It must have extremely low emissivity for far infrared radiation, so that it can limit loss of heat and keep itself from freezing. A tree whose leaves possess such a skin should be able to take root and flourish upon any comet as near to the Sun as the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. Farther out than Saturn, the sunlight is too feeble to keep a simple leaf warm, but trees can grow at far greater distances if they provide themselves with compound leaves. A compound leaf would consist of a photosynthetic part, which is able to keep itself warm, together with a convex mirror part, which itself remains cold but focuses concentrated sunlight upon the photosynthetic part. It should be possible to program the genetic instructions of a tree to produce such leaves and orient them correctly toward the sun. Many existing plants possess structures more complicated than this. Once leaves can be made to function in space, the remaining parts of a tree, trunk, branches, and roots, do not present any great problems. The branches must not freeze, and therefore the bark must be a superior heat insulator. The roots will penetrate and gradually melt the frozen interior of the comet, and the tree will build its substance from the materials which the roots find there. The oxygen which the leaves manufacture must not be exhaled into space. Instead, it will be transported down to the roots and released into the regions where men will live and take their ease among the tree trunks. One question still remains. How high can a tree on a comet grow? The answer is surprising. On any celestial body whose diameter is of the order of 10 miles or less, the force of gravity is so weak that a tree can grow out for hundreds of miles, collecting the energy of sunlight from an area thousands of times as large as the area of the comet itself. Seen from far away, the comet will look like a small potato sprouting an immense growth of stems and foliage. When man comes to live on the comets, he will find himself returning to the arboreal existence of his ancestors. 4. Flying squirrels. George Dyson lives 95 feet above the ground in a Douglas fir in British Columbia. His tree stands on land leased by friends from the provincial government. It is the last tree before the water, and the front window of his treehouse looks down into Indian Arm of the Strait of Georgia. The tree is the biggest around, and its foliage is dense. Through his seaward windows, George can look out unseen at the traffic on the strait. Through his landward windows, he can study anyone approaching from that direction. At night, the city of Vancouver glows on the horizon. George built his house in 1972, the year his father lectured on comets and the hospitality of interstellar space. George's stairs are the tree's branches. They make a spiral staircase, leading him round and round the trunk as he ascends. The first branches begin some distance above the ground, so at the foot of the tree, George has nailed a ladder. Climbing from the top rung to the first branch is difficult, and George intended it that way. He likes his privacy. The hands of any visitor are covered with pitch by the time he reaches George's door, but George knows where to put his own hands, and they stay clean. For visitors, even those young and nimble, the first few climbs up to the treehouse are scary, but George runs up as if his Douglas fir lay horizontal on the ground. He has climbed it drunk, and he has climbed it in winter storms. He could climb it in his sleep. All the motions, swinging around this branch, reaching for that one, pulling up, have been burned by repetition into his autonomic nervous system. He hauls up his firewood by rope. When he wants to descend, he rappels. The house is lashed to the tree, not nailed, for the treetop sways in the wind, and the attachment must be flexible to endure. George has confidence in the lashings. In 1975, the worst storm in many years hit British Columbia, and George, who at the time had been living elsewhere, moved back into his tree to see how a big storm felt. The storm did its best. The tree whipped wildly about. George fell asleep. The house is shingled inside and out with red cedar shakes. The outside shakes have weathered as dark as the tree trunk, fine camouflage. The inside shakes, protected from the weather, look fresh split, retaining the warm red blonde of the heart of the log they came from. The house has a single tiny room. The ship-tight red blonde interior is freeform, for George built to include 14 branches as structural members. His ingenuity does not call attention to itself, and the number of incorporated branches is a surprise when you total it up. The door's hinges are screwed into the main trunk. Above the hinges, the biggest of the inner limbs forks from the trunk, thick as a man's thigh, passes over George's bed, and exits through the wall. In the morning, George's eyes open wide and green on living bark, and he can pull himself out of bed on the limb's solidness. The bed is Procrustean. George is 6 feet tall, and the house is 2 or 3 inches narrower than that, so he must sleep slightly bent. The bed's hard planks are softened somewhat by a mattress of 2 blankets, thin and nondescript, which are covered by a Persian rug, thick and beautiful. At the head is a handmade leather cushion that George uses as a pillow. Like most of the things he has owned for a while, the cushion has begun to have the look of a talisman. It is round, shallow, and worn. It might be a Kwakiutl or Haida artifact that he stole from a museum. On the wall above the bed, a barometer is nailed, and next to it hangs a pair of binoculars in a leather case that George made himself. An octagonal window with leaded panes is inset in the wall beside the bed, and an identical octagonal window is inset at the foot. George can lie in bed and watch, through his binoculars and his leaded panes, any boats moving on the inlet. He has 3 rectangular windows, too. No point of the compass is hidden to him. Across from the bed is a small cast-iron wood-burning stove. Stamped on the front is New Albion Stove Works, and beneath that is the raised emblem of a fish, and beneath that is Victoria. Against the seaward wall is a tiny desk. On the desk are candles, a kerosene lamp, a small jar of flowers, another jar full of pens, a vial of washable blue ink, and a wooden letter seal. The seal was carved by a friend of George's. It is titled Ling Cod and shows a cod swimming among the stalks of a kelp forest. On the wall above the desk hangs a silver letter opener with Arabian designs on the scabbard and handle. Stored beneath the desk are a big jar of nuts, a few pots and utensils, and a coffee mug. The mug is thick, white, and plain. It came from an Alaska ferry. It is the kind of mug, says George, that a man on watch can take out on deck. It is the kind of mug that, on the bridge of a seiner, a man can set down heavily and satisfactorily, then return his attention to the helm. On the landward wall hangs a frying pan and a whisk broom and a toothbrush. When I visited, 2 books lay under the bed. One was the U.S. Coast Pilot for the Pacific Coast, 10th edition, 1968. The other was the Bering Sea and Strait Pilot, 1st edition, 1920. George is especially fond of the old 1920 volume. He chooses old books over new ones when he can. The old guides, assembled in the days of sailing ships, have better information on the winds. Wait for southeast wind and stay close-hauled on the port tack, and they tell George where, in 1913, the Indians rendezvoused in their canoes. Inside the old pilot book was a sketch of a canoe rudder George was planning. In the margin of the sketch was a note I have puzzled over and have never been able to decipher. It said, Dawn Treader, 3rd planet, Mariam. I would take this for a list of possible names for a canoe, except for the odd placement on the page. The note looks more like a crude map. Are these sailing instructions to some obscure region? Dawn Treader is the ship in C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, but is Mariam a misspelling of the Latin marum? I don't know. When I asked George the meaning of the note, he claimed to have forgotten. Outside the door, on the landward side of the house, hang 2 buckets for rainwater. They are brimful through most of the year, for maritime British Columbia is a rainy country. On the seaward branch is a birdhouse. Henry Thoreau was proud of building a grounded house at Walden for $28.12.5. George built higher, and for $20 less. He split all his shakes from a single drift log he found at sea and towed to shore. His 2 octagonal windows, his 3 rectangular windows, and most of his other materials are gifts or salvage. He spent $2 on a stovepipe and $6 on the string for his lashings. Sometimes George looks alarmingly like Thoreau, even in the style of his beard and the cut of his hair. From the old daguerreotypes, it is impossible to tell the color of Thoreau's eyes, but his gaze in black and white is as wide and arresting as the Dyson gaze. George, like Thoreau, suffers and enjoys a heightened sense of solitude. George has the same raw-boned ego, inflated to fill the solitude. His personality, like Thoreau's, is sharp with edges that companionship has not had opportunity to wear away. If George is Henry reincarnate, then their soul has made some progress since 1845, but entirely in matters of economy. Like Thoreau, George is a bean-eater. When George's body is entirely finished with the beans he has eaten, or the brown rice, or fish, or sprouts, he rappels down the tree and disappears briefly in the forest. In nature, he answers nature's call. Sometimes when it's raining hard or when he just doesn't feel like making the trip to Earth, he selects a red cedar shingle, uses it, then sails it like a frisbee out over the canopy of trees. In the autumn, George has trouble with flying squirrels. In that season, they besiege him like paratroopers. When he is home, there's no problem, for on hearing them bang into his windows or land on his doorsill, he shouts and they jump off to glide elsewhere. But when he is gone, they enter and burglarize his place. In British Columbia, 1974 was a bad year for flying squirrels. They were driving me crazy, George told me afterward. They were flying down from the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?